A black millionaire tech founder receives a chilling 10-second video, his 6-year-old daughter on her knees, scrubbing a filthy kitchen floor. No screams, no bruises, just silence and a stare that breaks him. This isn't discipline. It's something far darker. You're watching one of the most heart-touching stories you'll hear today. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon in San Francisco, the kind where time slips by almost unnoticed behind glass towers and digital calendars. Louis Moore, dressed in a sharp navy suit, sat behind his desk in a corner office that overlooked the bay. The room was modern, tasteful white walls, chrome fixtures, and a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the soft gray of a coastal sky. On the desk was a laptop, a phone, 2 neatly stacked notepads, and nothing out of place. Louis himself was just as put together. He carried the calm, careful composure of a man who had fought hard to stand where he was, CEO of Carter Innovations, a rapidly growing tech firm built from the ashes of his past. He had just finished a long video call with investors when his personal phone vibrated. At first, he ignored it. The call had left him mentally drained, and he was already thinking about the next meeting. But when it buzzed again, he glanced down. A text from an unknown number. Just one line, "Your daughter needs you." Attached was a video file. No name, no context, just 10 seconds long. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. The word "daughter" hit something in his chest he thought had been buried beneath 5 years of silence and progress. He opened it. The video was shaky, as if recorded quickly and secretly. The camera pointed toward a dimly lit hallway, carpet stained and walls bare. Then there she was. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, wearing clothes that were too small, too, worn her knees on the hard wooden floor, scrubbing with a dirty rag. Her hair was messy, pulled back in a loose braid, her hands moving in small, tired circles. Her eyes, his daughter's eyes, were red and puffy, not from dust, but from crying. She didn't speak. She didn't even look up. Behind the camera, a soft voice whispered, "Her name is Colette. She's not okay." Louis froze. The air felt too thin. His jaw clenched as his hand slowly lowered the phone to the desk. He hit replay, watched it again, and then again. Each time, something deeper in him broke. He hadn't seen Colette in over a year. The last time she had barely said a word, just held his hand for a few quiet minutes in a park, while Barbara watched from a bench, arms crossed, face unreadable. But even then, Colette had still looked like a child, whole, cared for. This was not okay. A knock on the glass door startled him. Jenna, his executive assistant, peeked in. "Just checking if you're still good for the 5 o'clock strategy call." He didn't answer right away. His mind was trying to stitch together what he had just seen with what he knew. Colette was supposed to be safe, with her mother, with Barbara. That was the agreement. That was why he hadn't pushed harder, why he had kept his distance. He was building something: stability, wealth, respect, things he thought would eventually speak for themselves. But the video made one thing brutally clear: none of it had mattered. "I need to reschedule," he said finally, his voice low and tight. Jenna blinked. "Everything okay?" He stood up, smoothing his jacket, but the motion was mechanical. "No, but I'm going to fix it." She nodded uncertainly and stepped out. Louis turned back to the window, pressing the phone to his chest like it was the only thing anchoring him to the moment. For the first time in years, he felt something old rise inside him: helplessness, rage, and a deep ache for his child. This wasn't about custody or paperwork anymore. This was about Colette. He called his travel coordinator. His voice was sharper now, faster. "I need the next flight to New York. Doesn't matter what it costs." There was a pause on the other end, then a confused reply. "Tonight, that's pretty tight." "Are you book it?" he said. "Now." After hanging up, he replayed the video again. 10 seconds. That's all it took to rip 5 years of quiet justification into shreds. He had told himself that staying away was the mature choice, that as long as Barbara wasn't asking for help, Colette must be okay. He had believed that his absence, though painful, was temporary, and that one day he would return when he could give his daughter everything she deserved. But he hadn't counted on the silence hiding something darker. As he packed his briefcase, Louis's phone buzzed again. This time a message from a board member, one of the older investors, a man in his 60s, white, polished, and known for saying things he thought were harmless. "Everything all right? Jenna said you're flying out last minute." Louis didn't answer, but the man sent another. "Hope it's not family drama. Those things blow up fast. But hey, I'm sure it's just a strict household. Some folks raise kids differently. Don't worry too much." Louis stared at the screen, his grip tightening. That last line burned. Just a strict household. No, that was not discipline. That was neglect. That was a child in pain. But the way it had been brushed off so casually reminded him why he had kept his distance for so long. Even when he started to build Carter Innovations, he had felt it, the constant pressure to prove himself, to never let emotion get in the way, to always be the most composed man in the room. Being a black founder in Silicon Valley wasn't about being great. It was about being perfect. And somewhere in that chase, he had told himself he couldn't afford distractions, not even the most important one of all. Now, as he walked through the building toward the elevator, everything felt hollow. The awards on the wall, the people nodding politely as he passed, the spotless conference rooms. None of it mattered if his daughter was scrubbing floors in silence. The ride to the airport was quiet. He sat in the back of a black car window, down halfway the evening wind, pushing against his temples like a cold reminder. Traffic moved slowly. His mind replayed memories he had locked away Colette as a baby, laughing in his arms. Her first steps across the old apartment floor. The day Barbara said she couldn't do this anymore. The custody meeting where he had walked in with hope and walked out with nothing. On the plane seated in first class, he didn't open his laptop. Didn't check his email. He just stared out the window. The city lights below looked like a grid of gold and shadow twinkling with all the lives he had tried to keep pace with. But none of them were hers. Not Colette's. She was in New York, in a house he had no control over, with a man he didn't trust. And for the first time in years, Louis stopped thinking like a businessman and started thinking like a father. He reached into his inside pocket, pulled out a small photo. Colette, age 3, smiling on a park bench. Her curls wild, her hands sticky with ice cream. That smile had cost him everything, and now it was time to fight to bring it back. He closed his eyes. The plane engines rumbled as they prepared for takeoff. He didn't pray. He didn't cry. He just whispered to himself, "I'm coming for you, baby girl." That was all she needed to know. The soft hum of the plane filled the cabin like a quiet, persistent thought. Louis sat motionless by the window, staring out at nothing in particular. The city beneath had long since disappeared into cloud cover, but his eyes remained fixed, as if searching for something he couldn't name. The video of Colette still echoed in his mind, her small body bent over a dirty floor, her silence louder than any scream. He hadn't spoken since boarding. Not to the flight attendant who offered him a drink, not to the man beside him who made a polite comment about tech stocks. He wasn't here for business, not this time. This trip wasn't about growth or market share. It was about something much simpler and infinitely heavier, being a father. His thoughts, like the flight path, curved back into the past without asking. He closed his eyes for a moment, and there it was again. Barbara's apartment 6 years earlier, the cramped kitchen filled with the scent of takeout and the noise of a box fan rattling against the window. Back then, things were different. They had nothing but they had each other, and that had seemed like enough for a while. He had been working freelance IT jobs, patching networks, installing servers, doing whatever he could to keep them afloat. Barbara taught evening classes at a community center, often coming home exhausted, her hair tied back, her shoulders slumped from standing too long. But at night, when Colette was asleep, they would sit on the couch with their knees touching and talk like dreamers. They wanted to buy a small house someday, maybe upstate. They wanted to travel to give Colette a life better than their own. But dreams are heavy when there's no money to carry them. The downward slide hadn't come all at once. It started with a failed investment. Louis had poured everything into a startup idea that never found footing. Then the freelance gigs dried up. He applied for jobs, dozens of them, but nothing stuck. Barbara picked up more shifts. The stress of it began to chip away at what they had. Arguments became routine. Not shouting matches, those would have been easier. It was the quiet kind of resentment, the sighs, the long pauses, the unfinished sentences. She would fold laundry without looking at him. He would avoid eye contact during dinner. They were both trying, and both tired. He remembered one night especially. Colette had just turned 6 months old, teething and crying endlessly. Barbara was bouncing her in the hallway, trying to soothe her, while Louis sat at the computer scrolling through job boards. He hadn't eaten all day. He looked up, saw Barbara's face, wet with tears, mouth-tight, eyes lost, and something inside him cracked. "I can't do this anymore, Louis," she had said quietly, not as a threat, but as a surrender. Not like this. He didn't answer right away. What could he say? that he was trying, that he loved them, that none of this was supposed to happen. He had said those things before, and still the bills came, the fridge stayed empty, and the job offers didn't. When Barbara brought up separation, it didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like inevitability, a slow drowning, and she was swimming toward the surface without him. She moved back in with her mother. The apartment was too small for all three, so Louis packed a bag and left. He stayed with an old college friend across town, slept on a couch, tried to pretend it was temporary. The custody talks were quiet and administrative. Barbara's family had lawyers. Louis didn't. He walked into the courtroom with a binder and walked out with a visitation schedule he never had the money or leverage to use. He remembered standing outside the courthouse that day, watching Barbara carry Colette to the car. The baby was asleep against her shoulder. He wanted to run after them to say something. Anything but all that came out was a breath. The lawyer had said it plainly. Without stable income, housing, or assets, Louis was not a viable custodial parent. It wasn't personal. It was what's best for the child. But what does a phrase like that even mean when it's wrapped in layers of unspoken judgment? When the court smiles kindly but never asks why Barbara's family refused to let Colette visit Louis's neighborhood, when nobody blinks at the fact that a black father trying to get back on his feet is somehow a greater threat than a white household with silent cracks underneath. Louis hadn't said any of that aloud. He was too tired to fight shadows. He had left New York soon after. Not because he didn't love his daughter, but because staying felt like being held under. San Francisco had offered a job, then an opportunity, and slowly, painfully, he rebuilt. He shared a one-bedroom with 2 roommates. He took late shifts and lived frugally. He said no to parties and yes to code. Years passed, and Carter Innovations was born out of a rented garage and endless trial. When the money finally came, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like oxygen. And still, through all of it, he kept a picture of Colette on his desk, not for motivation, but to remember what it had cost. Now, as the plane began its descent into New York airspace, Louis opened his eyes. The city stretched below in its messy, flickering sprawl. Somewhere down there, Colette was cleaning a floor while nobody watched, and for 5 years he had believed that silence meant peace. He adjusted his watch. The weight on his chest didn't lift. The anger hadn't passed. It had matured, no longer burning hot, but sharp and cold like steel. He wasn't here to scream. He was here to correct what should have never been allowed to happen. A flight attendant came by offering water. Louis took it, nodded, but didn't drink. His mind was already ahead, planning what to say, who to call, how to start. He would not knock politely on the door of his past and hope to be let in. He would walk through it, not as the man who once left, but as the man who came back with purpose. The seatbelt sign blinked on. The captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their arrival time and the weather on the ground. Louis barely heard it. His focus was on one thing, Colette. Not the girl in the court papers, not the toddler in the photo frame, but the 6-year-old child in the video, the one who had been let down not once but over and over again. He had given up too easily. He had trusted the wrong people. He had assumed that love from afar would be enough to protect her. Now he knew better. Love needed presence, protection needed proximity, and justice, real justice, needed someone willing to stand in the fire, not just watch it burn from a distance. As the wheels touched down and the plane slowed on the tarmac, Louis gripped the armrest. The city was no longer just a place on the map. It was the battlefield. And this time he wasn't coming as a broken man, hoping to be forgiven. He was coming as a father ready to reclaim his daughter and confront everything that had stolen her peace. He closed his eyes again, but just for a breath. Behind his eyelids, he saw her not crying, not cleaning, but laughing, running whole. He didn't know how long it would take or how hard the fight would be, but he knew this. He would not leave her behind again. Not for anything. Not ever. The apartment where Colette lived was neither warm nor cold, neither loud nor quiet. It simply existed, old gray and tired, like a space that had stopped expecting joy. It was 3 stories above a cracked stretch of sidewalk, the windows covered by dusty curtains that were always half closed, the air thick with the smell of mold, old cooking grease, and silence. This was not a place built for childhood. It was a place for survival. Inside, the rooms felt small, not because of their size, but because of what they contained. Every corner, every hallway seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next voice to rise, the next footstep to land too heavily. For Colette, 6 years old and already practiced at being cautious, this was home. She moved quietly, folded her clothes, neatly mopped the floors without being asked. She had learned that attention was dangerous, and the best days were the ones when no one raised their voices. Barbara, her mother, was still there, in body, but rarely in spirit. She drifted through the apartment like a ghost in old sweaters, always tired, always somewhere else in her mind. She worked part-time at a tutoring center, teaching spelling and math to middle schoolers who reminded her of the person she had once hoped to become. But at home, she was passive, withdrawn, dulled by a weariness she no longer questioned. She didn't hit Colette, she didn't scream, but she didn't protect her either. And in a house with Cain, that absence carried weight. Barbara noticed the chores getting done and took them for a responsibility. She noticed Colette's silence and mistook it for obedience. She never asked why her daughter flinched when the door opened, or why her eyes sometimes looked too old for her face. Cain, Barbara's husband, was the kind of man who filled a room whether he was speaking or not. He worked construction sometimes steadily, sometimes not. Most nights he came home with mud on his boots, beer on his breath, and a voice that echoed off the walls. He wasn't violent in the way that left bruises or drew attention, but his words, sharp, deliberate, and always bitter, cut just as deeply. He called Colette half-breed when he was angry girl when he wasn't. He never called her by name, never asked how she was, never offered warmth of any kind. When she cleaned the kitchen, he inspected it. When she was quiet, he mocked her. He seemed irritated by her very presence, as if she reminded him of something he didn't want to face. Worst of all, he made her feel like his resentment was something she had earned. "You live in my house," Cain said once after she dropped a fork in the sink. "You earn your keep. There's no one here to pamper you." Colette didn't cry. She had stopped crying long ago. She simply picked up the fork, wiped it with her napkin, and carefully placed it back on the table. At school, Colette was known as the quiet one. She never caused trouble, never raised her hand, never said anything rude. Her teachers described her as gentle but detached, as if her thoughts lived somewhere separate from the room. Other children ignored her or teased her in the careless way children often do when they sense someone different. Her clothes were clean, but outdated. Her lunchbox was plain, sometimes empty. She sat alone, until Chloe showed up. Chloe was loud in the way that only children raised in love and safety can be. She laughed without apology, asked questions without fear, and spoke her mind even in front of adults. She lived with her mother, a night shift nurse who somehow managed the impossible, keeping Chloe fed, loved, and safe. Their apartment was modest, but full of life blankets folded on the couch, music humming from the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon often lingering in the air. Chloe noticed Colette before anyone else. She saw the way Colette winced at sudden noises, the way her eyes scanned the room before she spoke. At first, Chloe didn't ask questions. She simply sat beside her, day after day. And slowly, Colette began to lean toward the warmth. They became friends, not through conversation, but through crayons, shared glances, and quiet walks home from school. Sometimes Chloe gave her half a sandwich. Sometimes she drew funny cartoons just to coax out a tiny smile. One afternoon, Chloe invited Colette over for cookies. Her mother had baked them before leaving for work. The apartment smelled like butter and sugar. Colette stepped inside with cautious eyes and tense shoulders. She had never been in a home that didn't feel heavy. That hour watching cartoons, eating cookies, sitting cross-legged on a carpet without judgment was the first time in a long while that Colette felt like a child again. During one of those visits, about a week before the video was sent, Colette did something unusual. She spoke up. They were sitting on the bedroom floor, coloring in an old exercise book, when Colette quietly set down her crayon and turned to Chloe. "Do you think I should try calling him?" she asked, her voice low. Chloe stopped what she was doing. "Your dad?" Colette nodded slowly. "I just want to try. Just once." Chloe didn't hesitate. She stood, went to her mother's closet, and brought back the phone. She didn't ask for more. Colette took it with trembling fingers, then pulled from her pocket a small, crumpled slip of paper she had found days earlier, tucked into a stack of old bills in the back of the hallway closet while she was cleaning. It had Lewis's name and number written in faded ink. She typed in the digits and pressed call. The phone rang once, then again. Then came a mechanical voice. "The recipient is not available at the moment. Please call again later." She stared at the screen for a moment, then handed the phone back and reached for her crayon again. She said nothing more that afternoon. That silence stuck with Chloe. It bothered her more than she could explain. Seeing Colette gather the courage to reach out and be met with nothing, no voice, no answer, made her angry. Not at Louis, whom she didn't know, but at the way everything seemed built to keep Colette small, quiet, and unseen. So, when Chloe saw her friend kneeling on the floor that weekend, scrubbing a stained corner of the living room carpet with raw hands, something inside her broke. Kane had just passed through the hallway, muttering about lazy hands and stupid girls slamming the door as he left. Colette didn't flinch. She just kept scrubbing. Chloe, standing in the doorway, reached into her pocket, took out her mother's phone, and hit record. 10 seconds. That was all. The camera captured Colette on her knees, head down, her movements tired but precise, her clothes too small, her body too still. Chloe's voice, steady and soft, came through at the end. Her name is Colette. She's not okay. That evening, Chloe's mother watched the video without saying much. Her face grew still. She opened her old contacts and found the number Louis had given her years ago, the same day he had tried to see Colette, but left without speaking to Barbara. If anything ever happens, he had said, if she ever needs me, call. Together, Chloe and her mother sent the video with a short message, "Your daughter needs you." Then they waited. Colette never knew about the message. That night, she finished her chores as usual. She ate dinner in silence. She brushed her teeth without being reminded. Then she went to bed, small hands tucked under the pillow, back turned to the door, eyes wide open in the dark. But far away in another city, the message arrived. And for the first time in 5 long years, someone who mattered finally saw her. Louis hadn't been back to that part of New York in nearly 5 years. The city had changed in places. Glass towers now stood where old laundromats once buzzed, and bike lanes had been painted across streets that used to smell of burnt coffee and bus brakes. But the block where he once lived hadn't changed. It still had the same cracked sidewalks, the same leaning power lines, the same tired stoop where old men sat and judged the weather and whoever walked by. He parked a rented black sedan a few houses down and stepped out, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted the collar of his coat. He could already feel the eyes on him, curious, narrowed, measuring. A tall black man in an expensive coat, walking into a part of town that rarely saw that kind of return. As he made his way up the sidewalk, a woman across the street pulled her child closer. An older man, white, sitting on a lawn chair, muttered just loud enough. Some folks only come back when they're trying to prove something. Louis didn't flinch. He didn't have the energy. His thoughts were too full of a 6-year-old girl and a 10-second video that had stolen his sleep for 3 nights straight. He stepped onto the porch of the building. The wood creaked beneath him, same as it always had. He knocked. The door opened a crack just far enough for Barbara's face to appear. She looked older. Not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet erosion of time, a softness in the jawline, heavier eyes, skin that no longer carried light. She stared at him like a stranger. Then the recognition came, slow and reluctant. "Louis," she said, not warmly, not coldly, just a fact like noting the time of day. "I need to see her," he said. Barbara didn't answer right away. She opened the door wider, and there she was, Colette, on her knees, on the floor, scrubbing the linoleum with a cloth that looked more like an old shirt than a cleaning rag. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hands moved with precision, her head was bowed. Louis's heart clenched. There was no theater in it, no exaggeration, just a quiet implosion inside his chest. He stepped forward. "Colette," he said. Her hands froze, her head turned slowly. Their eyes met. And for a second, everything else faded. The apartment, the tension, the weight of lost years. Her lips parted slightly. She didn't speak. She just stood up and walked toward him, step by step, then closer, then closer. When she reached him, Louis knelt. Without hesitation, Colette wrapped her arms around his neck, small, fragile, but firm. Kane appeared in the hallway, a beer can in hand. He was shorter than Louis remembered, but wider. His presence filled the space with tension. "What is this, a reunion show?" Kane asked, voice thick with mockery. Louis stood Colette still in his arms. "I'm taking her." Kane laughed once bitterly. "You think you can just walk in here with your shiny shoes and your new money and play daddy you left?" "I lost her," Louis replied. "That's different, and I'm not here to play anything. I'm here because I saw what she's living in. I'm here because she needs better." Barbara hadn't moved. She watched them from the corner of the room, arms crossed tightly. Her eyes darted between Louis and Kane, but her mouth stayed shut. "You really think you'll keep her?" Kane said, stepping closer. "You walk out that door, you better be ready to lose her all over again." Louis looked down at Colette, then back up. "If I don't walk out that door, I'll have already lost her." No one stopped him. Not Barbara. Not Kane. He turned and walked out, his daughter in his arms, her head resting against his shoulder. She didn't cry. Neither did he. But everything had changed. Behind him, the door closed, and for the first time in years, Louis felt the weight of being a father settle back into his chest, not with fear, not with guilt, but with certainty. Louis didn't sleep that night. Colette lay in the guest room of his rented apartment, curled up beneath soft blankets that still smelled like detergent and plastic wrap. It was the first clean bed she'd slept in for as long as she could remember. Her hands clutched the edge of the comforter tightly, and even in sleep, her small shoulders twitched as if bracing for sounds that never came. She didn't cry, but her eyes had that red-rimmed, hollow look of someone too used to holding it in. Louis sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. His phone sat next to him, silent, screen dark, waiting. He knew what came next wouldn't be simple. Taking Colette out of that house had been a choice made from instinct, from love, from a place deeper than words. But keeping her, giving her a future that was going to require a fight. And fights like this didn't get won in kitchens. They got won in court. The next morning, he called Rachel King. She met him at her office on the Upper West Side, a quiet space with real wood furniture and walls lined with casebooks that looked as worn as they were useful. Rachel was in her early 50s, sharp-eyed, with a calm voice that didn't waste syllables. She greeted Louis with a firm handshake, motioned him to sit, then listened. He told her everything. The years of distance, the lost custody battle, the video, the apartment, the floor cane. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. When he finished, Rachel leaned back. "You did the right thing by coming here, but we're going to need more than your word. The courts aren't known for trusting fathers who show up after 5 years, especially black fathers. I'm going to be blunt, Louis. You're walking into a system that was never built with men like you in mind. We need facts, evidence." "I want to do this right," Louis said, "whatever it takes." And so they began. Rachel started by reaching out to the people closest to Colette's daily life, people who might have seen what no one else had the courage to speak about. The first visit was to Colette's school. Miss Thompson, her homeroom teacher, was in her late 30s and had been teaching long enough to stop being surprised by what some children had to carry on their small shoulders. When Rachel and Louis arrived, she didn't blink at the reason they gave. "Colette Moore," she said, walking them into the quiet classroom, "is one of those students you remember because she makes you feel helpless. Sweet girl. Never disruptive, but there was always something withdrawn. Like she was holding her breath all day long. We had her tested for learning issues, but everything came back normal. Still, she never made eye contact with male staff. Not once." "Did anyone ever file a report?" Rachel asked. Miss Thompson hesitated. "There was never a bruise, never a complaint. Nothing concrete, just a feeling that she was afraid of the world. I've had other kids like that, but Colette's silence felt trained, like she wasn't just quiet, she was careful." They took notes. Rachel didn't rush. She let silence linger when it needed to. That's where the truth usually lived. Next was the pediatrician. Dr. Mitchell was a small man with a gentle presence, the kind of doctor who still kept lollipops in a jar, even though he knew kids didn't care for them anymore. He pulled out Colette's file and scanned the entries. "Colette's checkups were always attended by her mother," he said. "She never spoke much. That's not uncommon. But when I tried to make eye contact, she looked away. Every time." "Did she ever seem frightened?" Rachel asked. "Not in an obvious way," he replied, "but her body language stiff, defensive. I asked about her sleeping patterns once because she had dark circles. Barbara said she was just a light sleeper. It never crossed the threshold for me to report, but in hindsight, it adds up." They left with copies of the records, which Rachel tucked into a brown folder labeled in her precise handwriting, Moore versus Harris. Meanwhile, Colette spent her days moving slowly through this unfamiliar new space. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when Louis tried to talk with her, she would nod or shake her head, but seldom made eye contact. She followed him from room to room, not in fear, but as if uncertain whether she was allowed to be alone. She folded her pajamas every morning. She cleaned up after herself without being asked. When he offered her a choice between cereal or toast, she hesitated, as if weighing which answer might upset him less. One afternoon, he found her gently wiping down the already clean table with a paper towel. Her face focused, her lips pressed together. She didn't seem scared, just conditioned. Finally, they visited a corner grocery store near Barbara's apartment. The owner, Mr. Salim, recognized Colette right away from the description. Little girl always in that yellow jacket. Yes, yes. She used to come in alone, very quiet. Always paid in change. Never spoke unless I asked her a direct question. Once I asked where her parents were. She said she was allowed to come alone as long as she didn't talk to anyone. That sentence hit Louis hard. He hadn't expected to cry, but something cracked in his throat. Rachel didn't look away. She just gently placed a hand on his forearm and kept moving forward. By the end of the week, they had a growing folder of statements, medical notes, and school observations. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a pattern. And patterns mattered. We're getting somewhere, Rachel said one evening as they sat together reviewing everything. But the court will want to know why now, why you suddenly care. We know the truth, but they don't. Then I'll tell them, Louis said quietly. All of it, even the parts that make me look bad. Because this isn't about me looking good. It's about making sure she's safe. Rachel nodded. Then we're going to fight. It wasn't a declaration. It was a promise. And for the first time in a long time, Louis felt like he had someone in his corner who wasn't judging his past, but betting on his future. Rachel King was not the kind of lawyer who needed dramatics to command attention. Her calm was sharper than noise. When she spoke, judges leaned in, not because she demanded it, but because her words carried weight, thought, and clarity. After weeks of investigation meetings and document requests, she sat at her desk in her modest Brooklyn office reviewing the mounting case against Kane Harris. Her fingers moved over the files slowly, intentionally. Witness statements, medical notes, school records, photographs. But what she needed was something undeniable, something a judge couldn't explain away with doubt or legal gymnastics. That something came from Chloe. Rachel had arranged to meet Chloe and her mother again, this time in a quieter setting. A warm living room, modest furniture, and the smell of cocoa in the air. Chloe sat on the couch beside her mom, a little more serious than usual. Rachel turned on the recorder, but her voice was gentle, not legalistic. Chloe, can you tell me again about what Colette is and isn't allowed to do at home? Chloe nodded, playing with the hem of her shirt. She's not allowed to talk loud, not even laugh. Once she giggled at something funny on TV, and Mr. Kane made her stand in the hallway for a long time. He said, "Good girls don't make noise." Rachel leaned forward slightly, her voice lower. "Has she ever told you how that makes her feel?" Chloe nodded again. "She says she feels like her feelings don't matter. Like if she cries, she's bad. If she's happy, she's bad. So she tries to just be quiet, all the time." Rachel made a few notes, then turned off the recorder. She didn't need more. She had more than enough to ask for supervised custody at the very least. But Rachel, like Louis, didn't want the minimum. They wanted the truth to be heard. Later that week, Louis sat with Colette in the safety of his temporary apartment. It was a small space near Prospect Park, with light spilling through the windows and floorboards that creaked with age but not tension. Rachel had visited the night before and left something behind, a small soft jacket with a recording device stitched carefully into the lining. Louis took a breath before explaining. He didn't want Colette to feel like a tool in a game between adults. He sat beside her eye level and said, "Sweetheart, there's something I need your help with, but only if you feel safe." Colette, ever watchful, looked at him quietly. "Do you remember the things Kane says to you, how they make you feel?" She nodded just slightly. "If we had something that showed people the truth, what really goes on, would you want that? It might help the judge understand." Colette hesitated, then nodded again. So she wore the jacket. Not every day, just when she was sure Kane would be home and things would feel normal, which meant tense. On a Wednesday afternoon, the recorder captured his voice clearly. The words were as cold and unmistakable as anyone feared. "You don't talk back to me. You understand. You don't get to have feelings. You're just a half-breed with no place to belong. If you want a home, you work for it." Rachel played the recording back in her office twice. Then she pressed a hand to her mouth. Not because she was surprised, but because it still hurt to hear a child spoken to that way. The next day, she filed an emergency request for a custody hearing. Meanwhile, Steve, the private investigator Lewis had quietly hired, called Rachel with updates. He didn't bother with pleasantries. Found a police report from 10 years ago. Kane was arrested for domestic assault. Girlfriend at the time, African-American 27, claimed he threw her into a wall. She refused to press charges. That's not enough, Rachel said. We need a pattern. I'm not done, Steve replied. 2 years later, a woman named Teresa Lamont was found dead in her apartment in Jersey City. Circumstances unclear, but Kane was dating her. He was questioned but released. Too little to pin it on him, but it's in the file. Rachel closed her eyes. Anything else? He's got debts. A lot of debt. Gambling mostly. Guys on edge. Losing control. Lewis listened to all of it stone still. When Rachel showed him the recording, he didn't speak at first. He just stared at the waveform on the screen. Then he turned away, clenched his jaw, and whispered, "We're not backing down." Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder. "We've got a case. A real one. We're not walking into court with words and wishes. We've got truth. We've got her voice." Lewis didn't nod. He didn't smile. But his eyes softened, and that was enough. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about protection. It was about showing his daughter that someone would stand up when no one else had, that her voice mattered, that she mattered. The courtroom was nothing special. Pale green walls, a few dull wooden benches, fluorescent lighting that hummed faintly overhead. But for Lewis, standing there in his press suit, with his hands clenched just tight enough to leave marks on his palms, it might as well have been the center of the world. Rachel stood beside him, calm as ever, a thick folder in one hand, eyes sharp and clear. On the other side of the room, Barbara sat alone. Her eyes were puffy, her shoulders slumped forward, like the air itself was too heavy. Kane was not present. His absence was both a relief and a reminder. A man like that did not need a courtroom to be dangerous. Judge Meredith Lawson, a seasoned woman in her 60s, took the bench with no fanfare. Her robe hung a little loose and her silver hair was tied back in a neat twist. She didn't smile, didn't nod. She simply looked over the files, then peered down at both parties over her reading glasses. "We're here to review the emergency motion for change of custody, filed by Mr. Lewis Moore, represented by counsel. The motion includes allegations of emotional abuse and neglect. The respondent, Miss Barbara Harris, is present. Mr. Kane Harris has declined to appear." Rachel rose. Her voice was steady, unhurried. She laid out the facts: Colette's silence in school, her visible anxiety, the recorded threats from Kane, the background reports from Steve. She didn't dramatize. She didn't need to. The truth, when assembled with care, had its own weight. Then she played the audio. The courtroom didn't move. Judge Lawson listened in full, without interruption, hands folded under her chin. Kane's voice, rough and cold, echoed through the speakers. The slurs, the contempt, the control, and then the silence afterward, as if even the air had flinched. Rachel turned off the recording and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, this is not just a case of one bad man. It is a case of a child growing up in an environment where her identity, her voice, and her safety are being stripped from her. Miss Harris may not have raised her hand to her daughter, but her silence enabled this harm. Mr. Moore seeks full custody, not out of vengeance, but out of love and responsibility. He has the resources, the stability, and the willingness to give Colette a life where she can grow, not just survive." Barbara was given her chance to respond. She didn't stand. Her voice was small, almost whispering. "I didn't know how to leave him," she said. I thought keeping things calm was the best I could do." Judge Lawson nodded slowly. "Did you witness this behavior firsthand? The insults, the threats?" Barbara's eyes filled with tears. She nodded. "Yes." "And you didn't intervene?" "I didn't think I could." The judge leaned back. She didn't look angry. She looked tired, as if she had seen this kind of thing more times than she cared to remember. "This court does not make decisions based on punishment," she said. "It makes decisions based on the best interests of the child." She looked at Lewis. "Mr. Moore, do you intend to allow Miss Harris to have a continued relationship with her daughter, provided it is safe and supervised?" Lewis didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor. Colette deserves to know her mother, but she also deserves to be safe." The judge paused. Then she spoke clearly and finally. "This court grants full legal and physical custody to Mr. Lewis Moore. Miss Harris will have supervised visitation rights with review in 6 months." It wasn't a dramatic verdict. There was no gasp in the courtroom. No cheers, but Lewis exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Rachel squeezed his arm. Colette was safe. After the session ended, Louis found Barbara in the hallway. She looked at him, then down at the floor. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know how to fight him." Louis didn't offer anger. He didn't offer comfort, only the truth. "I wish you'd tried, but you still can." She nodded just once and turned to leave. For the first time in a long time, she walked without dragging her feet. Outside the courthouse, Louis pulled out his phone and called Rachel's office. "It's done," he said. "She's coming home." And even though the world hadn't changed, even though Colette still had healing ahead, something in him shifted. Not triumph, just clarity. She was no longer alone. The tension that had been quietly simmering in the background for weeks finally broke surface 2 days after the custody hearing ended. Louis was still riding the emotional turbulence of that courtroom victory, feeling an unfamiliar blend of relief and wariness. He wasn't celebrating. Not really. How could he? When every step forward felt like walking through broken glass barefoot with his daughter's well-being hanging in the balance, Colette had been adjusting slowly to the changes, sleeping in shorter spurts, clinging to her routines, and still whispering instead of speaking full sentences unless absolutely necessary. But at least she smiled now. Louis had caught one just the night before while reading a story on the living room couch. A flicker of trust, a spark. He had thought it was the beginning of something solid. He had no idea how quickly things could crumble again. The day started as usual. Colette went to school under the supervision of the court-approved liaison. Louis had a scheduled follow-up meeting with Rachel and Marcus to begin the formal process of therapy enrollment and long-term family reintegration. Around 2 in the afternoon, while Louis was reviewing paperwork, his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. The message was a video file. No text, no name, just a video. That alone made his chest tighten. He played it. There was no preamble, no noise except the sound of wind. The camera was shaky, low-res, but unmistakably real. Colette, bound at the wrists, gagged loosely with what looked like a torn shirt, was sitting in the corner of what looked like a basement bare floor. No windows. A single hanging bulb above her, casting a shaky circle of light. The person behind the camera stepped forward, and Louis didn't need to see his face to know who it was. The boots, the posture, the voice. Kane. "You think you've won the voice, drawled calm but cold, but you don't get to walk away with what's mine. You want to play Father of the Year. Let's see what kind of man you really are when there's no courtroom, no lawyer, just you and what matters most." The video cut off. Louis's entire body went still. No breath, no blinking. Then a flush of heat climbed his neck like fire under skin. His throat closed up. His knees buckled slightly, but he caught himself on the edge of the table, fingers digging into the wood. Rachel looked up and saw the color drain from his face. What happened? He didn't answer with words. He just turned the screen to her. Within minutes, Marcus was on the line with precinct dispatch. They began tracing the metadata on the file, coordinating with cybercrime and mobile triangulation units. Rachel tried to steady Louis's hand while he scrolled through the screen again and again. His other hand trembled against the edge of the desk, and for the first time since he had returned to New York, the carefully managed shell around him cracked. Louis stood. "We're not waiting for a damn warrant. He took her. He's going to hurt her. We go now." "Wait," Marcus said, placing a hand on Louis's shoulder. "If we move in too fast and he sees us coming, I'm not talking about law. I'm talking about my daughter. You either come with me or you don't." Rachel didn't object. She just closed her briefcase and followed. The address pinged from a cluster of industrial warehouses off the Belt Parkway, a strip of properties long since shut down or abandoned. The GPS locator inside Colette's jacket, the one Louis had slipped into her lining weeks ago, was still transmitting. Weak, but alive. They arrived just after sunset. The air smelled like old diesel and rust. The place was vast quiet, the wind rattling against broken siding. Marcus led the way, gun drawn but kept low, issuing quiet instructions into his radio. Rachel stayed in the car, her phone in hand, feeding live coordinates to backup officers en route. Louis didn't wait. He stormed toward the dark building with nothing in his hand but rage. Inside, the place was colder than it should have been. Long rows of stacked crates, rotting pallets, broken shelving. The place echoed, made every footstep feel like a gunshot. Then a sound, faint but sharp. A whimper, a dragging sound. Louis moved faster, turned a corner, found a locked door, kicked once, twice. On the third strike, it burst open, and there she was. Collette's eyes wide back, pressed against the wall, wrists red from rope. Kane stood a few feet away, arms folded, smirking. "You don't learn, do you?" Kane said, stepping forward. "Always thinking you can clean up after other people's mistakes. You think the court means something to people like me? You're done." Lewis's voice was low, even, not yelling, but something in it made Kane pause. Or what Lewis didn't answer. He just moved. The fight wasn't elegant. It wasn't choreographed. It was raw, angry, full of years of swallowed silence. Kane swung first, landing a fist across Lewis's jaw, but Lewis didn't fall. He lunged back, driving his shoulder into Kane's ribs, knocking him against the crates. Kane grabbed a metal rod and swung wildly. It grazed Lewis's arm. Lewis tackled him. They crashed to the floor. Colette screamed. That one sound was the final push. Lewis pinned Kane, blood dripping from his temple, and raised a fist. But he stopped, breathing hard, heart pounding. Then he looked at Colette, frozen in the corner, terrified. He dropped his hand. Police sirens rang out in the distance. Lewis stood up. "You're going to jail. This time nobody's covering for you." Marcus and 2 officers rushed in, seconds later, cuffing Kane. Lewis knelt by Colette, gently loosening the knots. She flinched, but when she saw it was him, she let go. "Daddy," she whispered. He held her, just held her. "You're safe now," he said. "You're safe." She cried like she hadn't been allowed to cry in years. And outside, under the first stars of the evening sky, they walked out together past the flashing lights, past the shattered silence, into something that finally resembled a beginning. The days following the rescue were slow, almost muted, like the world had turned down its volume to let a broken child begin to breathe again. Colette, now safe, no longer looked over her shoulder every time someone spoke too loudly. But safety didn't mean healing, and Lewis understood that better than anyone. He had seen enough of life to know that trauma did not leave quietly, that pain had a habit of staying long after the danger had passed. So he did not rush her. He did not press her with questions or expect overnight smiles. Instead, he let her wake when she wanted. He let her eat in silence. He offered her space without distance, and slowly, that space began to fill with something other than fear. The first time Colette spoke more than a sentence, it was in the kitchen, watching toast pop out of the toaster. She said very softly, "I don't like the smell of beer." Lewis paused. His hands froze mid-motion, butter knife hovering over bread. He turned to her, nodded once, and said, "Okay." That was it. No questions, no assumptions. Just a small thread of connection carefully laid across a gap that had once felt unbridgeable. That moment marked a beginning. Rachel had connected them with a child therapist, a warm, middle-aged woman named Marlene, who had a voice like old lullabies and eyes that didn't judge. The session started with drawings. At first, Colette drew only houses, small boxes with one window and no doors. Then came figures, a girl with her head down, a man with no face, a woman with her hands behind her back. Over time, the pictures changed. The girl stood up. The man turned away. The woman reached out a hand. Marlene didn't interpret too much aloud, but Lewis saw it. Each line on the paper was a whisper of healing. Barbara, after the abduction and hearing Kane's final threats play out, began her own quiet reckoning. She didn't try to contact Lewis immediately. She knew better than to barge into a life she had neglected. Instead, she started attending group therapy sessions for women recovering from emotional dependency. She sat in small folding chairs beside strangers who spoke in careful, cracked voices about shame, about silence, about survival. For the first time in years, Barbara spoke the truth. "I didn't hit my daughter, but I didn't stop him either." Her hands shook when she said it, but she said it, and that mattered. Eventually, Lewis agreed to a supervised visit. They met at a neutral family center, walls painted in cheerful pastels with puzzles and storybooks neatly arranged on low shelves. Colette didn't run to Barbara. She didn't hide either. She sat beside Lewis, her small hand gripping his 2 fingers, and just watched. Barbara sat across from them, eyes full of tears she didn't try to wipe away. "I'm sorry," she said, voice raw. "I didn't know how to fight him. I didn't know how to protect you." Colette didn't respond, but she didn't leave the room. That was enough for now. At home, Lewis created a rhythm. Mornings began with soft music, a shared breakfast, and sometimes just sitting by the window without speaking. Afternoons included time at the library, where Colette began picking books by color rather than title. Evenings were quiet, no television, just stories, puzzles, and drawing. The television stayed off unless Colette asked. The door to her room was always open, never forced closed. He let her set the rules of her world piece by piece, and he honored them. One evening, as autumn settled in with early sunsets and golden leaves, Louis found Colette in the living room with a stack of paper. She had drawn 3 figures, one tall man, one woman, and one small girl in between them. The girl was holding both their hands. Above the drawing, she had written the word us. He knelt beside her, gently touched the paper, and whispered, "That's beautiful." Colette looked at him for a long moment and nodded. They didn't need to define what family meant in exact terms. They were building it one quiet morning, one gentle night at a time. Barbara, still in therapy, began sending postcards, short messages that simply said, "Thinking of you," or "I'm proud of your courage." Colette never replied, but she kept each one in a shoebox under her bed. Healing, Louis learned, was not a straight line. It curved, paused, repeated. Some days were light, some heavy. But with each sunrise, the weight seemed a little easier to carry. In his own therapy sessions, something Rachel had encouraged Louis confronted his guilt. Not just the guilt of leaving, but the guilt of thinking success would compensate for absence. "I thought if I came back rich," he said, once voice low, "I could fix everything with a checkbook and a lawyer." His therapist only said, "You came back." That was the real currency. And she was right. By the time winter came, Colette had begun humming again. Not loud, not often. But Louis heard it. Little tunes while she drew, while she cleaned her crayons, while she looked out the window. She hummed, and it sounded like life returning. The neighborhood, too, changed in small ways. Some neighbors, once distant, now nodded to Louis as he passed. A few apologized quietly, saying they hadn't known, hadn't wanted to get involved. Louis never asked for those apologies, but he accepted them. Forgiveness wasn't for their benefit, it was for Colette's future. There was no grand transformation, no parade of redemption. Just 3 people, 1 father, 1 daughter, and 1 mother trying to mend what had cracked. They didn't all live under the same roof, but they shared something now that was far more lasting than addresses. And for the first time in years, Louis looked at his daughter brushing her doll's hair in the afternoon light and felt peace. Not perfection, not certainty, but peace. And that was enough to keep going. The morning light streamed through the wide windows of Louis's new apartment, soft and golden, casting warm reflections across the hardwood floor. Colette stood quietly at the window, watching the city slowly stir to life. There was no shouting, no cold silence, just the steady hum of life outside and the low clink of dishes from the kitchen where Louis was preparing breakfast. The smell of toasted bread and eggs filled the air, and for the first time in years, Colette felt like mornings were something to look forward to. This place, small but full of light, wasn't just a roof over their heads, it was a beginning. A real beginning. She walked over to the kitchen, still in her pajamas, and Louis looked up from the stove and smiled. No words needed. Her presence was enough. Each weekday, Louis took Colette to her new school, a public charter program with teachers who cared and classmates who reflected the world outside black, white, brown, mixed, loud, shy, curious. Colette didn't speak much at first, but her teacher, Miss Samuels, never pushed. She noticed things. The way Colette watched other kids laugh. The way she slowly, week after week, began to raise her hand. The first time Colette volunteered to read aloud in class, Miss Samuels sent an email to Louis that night. She read beautifully. Not loudly, but with such care. "I just thought you should know." Their evenings were filled with routines that may seem ordinary to others, but were deeply healing for them. Louis would ask about Colette's day, and sometimes she would answer with a word, sometimes a full story. They made dinner together on Fridays. Saturday mornings were for the farmer's market. On Sundays, they baked cookies and called it Colette's Cafe. At bedtime, Louis would read to her, and she would fall asleep holding the edge of his shirt like a lifeline. These rituals weren't glamorous. They were steady, reassuring, real. Barbara started visiting once a week. At first, Colette didn't say much during those visits. She would sit drawing in her notebook or listening silently as Barbara asked about school or offered a cookie she'd baked. But over time, the tension eased. Barbara didn't try to force forgiveness. She didn't cry or make dramatic declarations. She simply showed up, sat beside her daughter, learned to stay. Sometimes they would color together or water the small plant on the windowsill. Sometimes they just sat in quiet. And slowly, those moments became something Colette could rely on. A different kind of healing took root, one built on presence instead of performance. Louis and Barbara didn't reconcile in the way people often expect. There was no grand reunion, no rekindled romance. But there was a new kind of partnership, respectful, focused on what Colette needed. They spoke calmly, coordinated school events, discussed therapy notes, shared responsibilities. Barbara began therapy of her own not because anyone told her to, but because she wanted to understand herself, wanted to be better, not perfect. Colette noticed. Children always notice, and that awareness softened something inside her. Not enough to forget, but enough to feel safe. One evening after dinner, Colette sat beside Louis on the couch, her small legs dangling off the edge. She looked up at him, brows furrowed slightly in thought. "Dad," she said quietly, "why am I different from the other kids?" Louis put down the dish towel in his hands and turned to her. The question didn't surprise him. He had been waiting for it, not dreading, not avoiding, just waiting for when she was ready to ask. "You're different," he said gently, "because you're one of a kind, and that's the most beautiful thing about you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, not because she fully understood, but because she believed him. Outside, the world remained complicated. There were still neighbors who stared too long, still comments made in low voices, still systems that moved slowly. But inside that apartment, there was laughter, there was choice, there was the freedom to say no, to ask for help, to rest, to dream. On the wall by her bed, Colette had started pinning drawings. One was of a tree with roots that stretched down into the earth and branches reaching high into the sky. Another was a picture of Louis drawn in crayon, smiling beside her at the park. And one small taped-up sketch was just the word home, written in her careful handwriting and framed in hearts. When school let out for summer, Louis surprised her with a trip to the library where she got her first card. She picked out 3 books. That night, she read one out loud to Louis, slowly stumbling a little, then faster. At the end, she looked up, beaming. "You did that," he said, voice quiet with pride. "You read that whole thing." She grinned. "Next time, I'll read too." And in that quiet apartment, in a city still spinning outside their window, father and daughter leaned back on the couch. No one shouted, no one hid, no one cleaned up after anyone else's mess. They just sat side by side in a place that finally belonged to both of them. And for the first time, Colette wasn't just surviving, she was growing. The doorbell rang. Chloe and her mother stood in the hallway with a tray of cookies. More laughter, more hands reaching for glasses of milk. The living room filled with the kind of noise that doesn't sting, only warmth, only care. There was no need for a fairy tale ending, but there was undeniably a beginning. Thank you truly for staying with us through the end of this emotional journey. If you made it this far, your heart has walked beside Colette, Louis, Barbara, and every quiet moment in between. This wasn't just a story. It was a real-life reflection woven with pain, courage, and a fight for something deeper than justice, dignity, love, and belonging. Stories like these aren't meant to just be heard. They're meant to be felt. So if something in this heart-touching story moved you, whether it was a small glance, a quiet act of strength, or a line that stayed with you, let us know in the comments. Tell us how you felt. Tell us where you're listening from. We'd love to know how this real-life story reached you wherever in the world you may be. To everyone who watched, listened, and felt something, your presence here matters. Your support helps keep these true stories alive. Inspirational stories, bedtime stories, emotional stories that speak to the human heart. This channel wouldn't be what it is without you. So if this story time meant something to you, give it a like. If you'd like to hear more heartwarming stories rooted in truth and told with care, please subscribe. There are many more voices waiting to be heard, many more lives quietly extraordinary waiting to be told. Until the next one, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Be well, be kind, and keep listening. We'll see you again soon.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.